Tonight we're going to follow on from Wallace with the Bruce family and Bannockburn, and also the Bruce connection to this part of the world, which was a very strong connection. And obviously Carrickfergus plays a big part in that too. So we're going to hopefully have a wee look as we go through at a contemporary account of all of this period, particularly in this area. And we'll try and decipher it together as we go through. It's written in medieval Scots. So last week I think we started with the poems Scots for Hay with Wallace Blade. Scots from Bruce is often led, welcome to you glory bed or to victory. This time we're going to start with another little poem which is not as well known by any stretch of the imagination. It's written by a man called Harry Brown, who's also known as John of the North, or John of the North. And he was a person who wrote a mixture of poems and what might be called commodious in terms of poetry, I think. But he wrote this one called History Without Tears. To Larne long ago came Edward the Bruce, but someone on shore shouted, it's not a bit of use. Go back again to Scotland with your men and your gear, for the English will kill you if you come over here. Dry up, cried Edward, in a couple of shakes, clear the English out like St. Patrick did the snakes. But alas for Edward, it was only big talk, for the English destroyed him down about Dundalk. P.S. It has always been a risky sort of thing for anyone to try to be an Irish king. So that's not quite on the same level as Robert Burns' Scots for Hay, but it alludes to a period in history that is certainly will be remembered considerably next year, including in this area, with a major anniversary being marked of the invasion of Ireland by the Scots, which took place in Larne, and then Carrickfergus played a big part of that, as we'll see. So John of the North was referring back to that in a humorous way in his poem. So last week we left a situation where Wallace had led the Scots to great victory at Stirling Bridge. Then they'd been defeated at Falkirk. There'd been a period of sort of guerrilla warfare, and eventually Wallace had been tried and executed, and the Scots were at quite a low ebb. Those Scots who were opposed to Edward ruling them looked for another contender after Wallace's death, and they would turn to Robert Bruce, the grandson of the Bruce who was not selected by Edward I in 1292 for the kingship. And Robert was about 30 years of old age at this time. He had been on the side of the king, the English king, and as we said last week, people changed sides quite a lot, quite alarmingly and confusingly changed sides, so it's hard sometimes to work out what side they're on. Maybe they didn't even know sometimes either. But Robert the Bruce had certainly been on the side of the king, King Edward I. But he regretted that, and sometime in 1306 he decided to assert his right to be the King of Scots. One of his main opponents was a member of another family that contended for the throne after Alexander III's demise, and that was John Comyn, known as the Red Comyn. And the two families had been in opposition over the kingship for many years. Quite a famous incident occurred. There may have been a reapproachment planned, but Bruce met Comyn in church in Dumfries to discuss the situation. They quarrelled. Bruce was known for being hot-headed, and he drew a dagger and stabbed Comyn at the altar in the church. So it's unclear whether the murder, and it wasn't Bruce that actually finished him off. Bruce left the church, and one of his supporters then went in and made sure that Comyn was dead. But it's unclear whether this was planned, whether it was a trap to get rid of Comyn as an opponent, or whether it happened in the heat of the moment when a quarrel started up. And we're probably never going to know the answer to that one. We do know that what happened next was that Bruce ended up being excommunicated by the Pope from the church because, I suppose, for twofold reasons. Firstly, the murder itself, but secondly, where the murder occurred was particularly significant at the altar of a church. An excommunication would have been a major thing at that time. It didn't deter Bruce, and Scotland at this point is quite, almost quite separated from the sense that the Pope is a secular head as well as a temporal head. And we'll see another way in which it's significantly separate, because some people seek refuge in Scotland who were at that point being persecuted by, particularly by the Roman Catholic Church and by the papacy. Bruce then is crowned King of Scotland at Scone, and the campaign then starts. The first skirmish against the English didn't go over well at a place called Methven in 1306. Bruce was defeated. He had to flee to the Highlands of Scotland. His brother was captured and was put to death. Another of his supporters, the Countess of Buchan, was put in a cage at Berwick Castle. In the Highlands there was also trouble with the MacDougals, who were allied to Cumming, who had been killed in the church. And they almost captured Bruce and they defeated his force, so it was an inauspicious start to this campaign to be King of Scots. But in 1307 Edward I died, known as Edward the Hammer, and he was about to bring another invasion north of the border at that point. His son, Edward II, was very different from his father. He had very little interest in war and certainly no interest in hard fighting. And the invasion force had arrived at Nithsdale when Edward ordered it back into England, as the king had died in the interim period between the force setting off and arriving in Scotland. There were a series of raids against Scottish-held castles when the army went back. Edward Bruce, who features largely in the story, the Ulster connection of all of this, was said to have taken 13 castles in Galloway alone once the English army went back across the border. And in 1314 the focus moved to Stirling, which was besieged by Edward and his forces, and was one of the last English garrisons left in Scotland. Edward made an agreement with the English inside the castle, and the agreement was that if the Stirling Castle was not relieved by Midsummer Day 1314, which is the 24th of June, it would be handed over to the Scots. So that sort of upped the ante. Robert the Bruce had not been party to this negotiation and agreement, and he was quite alarmed and concerned when he found out about it, because he believed that he didn't have sufficient men to take on a large English army, which he believed would then come north of the border in order to relieve the castle. So we're not quite sure what passed by way of conversation between him and his brother Edward, but he took Edward to task over this, and Edward is said to have replied, "Let the King of England bring all the men he has, we'll fight them and more." And that was precisely what was about to happen. The king wanted to relieve the castle. He wanted to secure his garrison in Stirling, so an army was sent north. It was described as the greatest army England has ever sent forth. And the accounts of it suggest that there were between 2,000 and 3,000 knights and 20,000 archers and spearmen, so a sizable army at that particular time. So between 2,000 and 3,000 knights and 20,000 archers and spearmen. Contrast that then with the fact that Bruce had 7,000 in his army, mainly infantry, some horsemen, and significantly some of the horsemen in the legend said to be Knights Templar, which was the group that Bruce had sheltered in Scotland. The Knights Templar became a very rich chivalric order in the medieval period, and they became so rich that they attracted the envy and jealousy of the King of France, and the King of France and the Pope decided between them effectively to try and get the riches the Templars had. So the Templars were, there were trials for heresy and all sorts of things were alleged about the Templars. A lot of the Templars were put to death, including the leader, the Grand Master of the Templars. But a significant proportion of them are said to have, did escape, and are said to have escaped to Scotland, where supposedly they brought the greatest treasure they had, which was the Holy Grail, and so forth. So that legend about all of this largely revolves around places like Roslin Castle, if you're into Dan, what do you call him, Dan Brown. But the Templars certainly found a home in Scotland, because since Robert had been excommunicated, Scotland was that little bit apart, and so there was safety in going to Scotland, so it would be a logical place to go. But they are said to have played a significant part in the battle. Whether they did or not is down to the legends again. We do know that Edward the Bruce led men from Lennox, Mar, Angus, Buchan and Menteith, and Robert the Bruce led those from Carrick on the other Carrick on the other side, and the Western Isles. There were a lot of Highland clans are listed under their own chieftains: Cameron, Campbell, Chisholm, Fraser, Gordon, Grant, Gunn, Mackay, McIntosh, McPherson, McCrory, McLean, MacDonald, McFarlane, McGregor, Mackenzie, Menzies, Munro, Robertson, Ross, Sinclair and Sutherland. Quite a consignment of Scots, although small in number. And on St John's Eve, the 23rd of June, the English arrived at Bannockburn, 3 miles from Stirling Castle. Robert had picked his ground well. He picked high ground for his army, drew them up on high ground. They were overlooking Bannockburn, they were overlooking a marshy area on their side of the burn, and in addition to that, the site was significant on the main road to Stirling, and Stirling was the gateway to the Highlands, as we said last week. It was a very important citadel in the context of Scotland. If you controlled Stirling, you had a stranglehold effectively in the Highlands. And what firm ground there was below what was called New Park, Robert had his troops engaged in digging pits. The pits were then covered over with turf to make them invisible. A network of steel spikes had also been placed in the ground to lame charging horses. So he had quite a defensive area. He picked a marshy area, he had traps dug, and he had steel spikes as well. The English army, when it arrived, a much larger force, was effectively tied in the landscape then, because he had picked the area he wanted. They came along. Not only were they tied in the landscape as to where they were, but they were also suffering a bit from a disjointed leadership. There were 2 men, the Earl of Gloucester, who was Edward II's nephew, and was also a kinsman of Robert the Bruce, and the Earl of Hereford. And Edward probably foolishly named the Earl of Gloucester initially as the commander of his army, but that upset the Earl of Hereford, and he ended up then having to say, oh well, actually you're joint commanders, decided. So the rivalry and jealousy between the 2 of them didn't go away on account of being joint commanders, and that in itself led to dissension over what should happen and who was taking charge and so forth. The one thing they probably had in common was a foolish contempt for the Scots army that they saw in front of them, which they believed that they would soundly defeat very easily. A very famous incident occurred the day before the battle. As the vanguard of the English force approached New Park, Robert was on a small grey pony, inspecting his men. He had just his battle axe with him, and an English knight called Sir Henry de Bohun saw an opportunity to create panic among the Scots, and he charged, identified Robert Bruce, and he charged on his war horse with the intention of wiping him out. The difficulty was that on this great war horse, with all the armour and so on, he wasn't as manoeuvrable as Robert on his small grey pony was, so Bruce waited until the charge had reached a certain point, and then he turned the pony deftly around. The Bohun went past, and Bruce lifted himself in the saddle and brought the axe down on the Bohun's head, splitting his head in half and his helmet in half as well. So it was an auspicious start for the English army, thinking that they were going to wipe out the commander of the Scots right away because he was relatively defenceless where he was, but they hadn't taken into account this dexterity in terms of how the Scots operated. There was a skirmish after that, and the English retreated, and that was the day before the main battle. And the real battle took place just after daybreak on Midsummer Day, 1314. The Scots began the attack. Edward Bruce moved forward in the Chilterns that we talked about last week, the formations of spearmen. And a cavalry charge was ordered by the Earl of Gloucester against this formation that was coming down towards them. That meant that the English bowmen could not attack the Scots because they had in front of them the back of the English cavalry, so they couldn't see where their arrows were going to go, and therefore it wasn't a very good military move. The English archers in turn were then scattered by a cavalry charge from the Scots under Sir Robert Keith, and in the melee in the area between the Bannockburn and the high ground, the English knights were heavily armoured, and see we have some armour here and some people are wearing armour tonight, so you can imagine in a marshy ground how that would have played out. They floundered in the marshes, they fell into the concealed pits, and they became easy prey for the Scots spearmen. And that's effectively how the battle took shape. Then at a point in this battle, camp followers appeared on the horizon. The English mistook them for reinforcements, probably believing that there had been a ruse to give them the sense that there was a smaller force. The Scots had a smaller force than they actually had. So when they saw these camp followers appear, they believed that a major attack was now coming from a larger force, and they tried to leave the field. The retreat became a rout. Edward II was forced from the melee by his bodyguard for his own safety. He had one horse killed under him, and they quickly took him. They took him towards Stirling Castle, where the constable of the castle of Mowbray wouldn't allow him admittance, which maybe the sort of thing could lose you your head possibly if you did that to the monarch. But his reasoning was that if the king came into the castle was still going to be besieged, and greater effort would be made then to capture the castle because the king was inside it, and the king would not be safe. So he wouldn't allow the king in. And Edward then and his royal party, closely pursued by James Douglas, made their way to the coast, where they got a ship to Berwick, to the relative safety of Berwick. One of the English officers, a man called Pembroke, he saw the king off the field, and he then tried to muster what remained of his own contingent. Most of them were Welsh, and he led them home by way of Carlisle, famously barefoot, and leading them on foot towards the end of all of that. The outcome of it all was also at this point when supposedly at a crucial point Bruce's cavalry were brought into play to finish off the English, and this is when the legend has started that these were the Knights Templar who were paying back Robert the Bruce for offering them safety by defeating the English army. Nearly all the archers and foot soldiers in Edward II's army were either killed or captured at Bannockburn. One historian, Robert Chatterton Newman, he said Bannockburn was an unmitigated disaster for England and the greatest victory of the period for Scotland. Beside the ordinary soldiers who died that day, 700 knights and scores of English noblemen fell in battle or drowned in the bogs or the tidal waters of the River Forth as they tried to escape. 500 men of rank were made prisoner, and for the next year were exchanged for the Scots taken hostage in 1306. So a real disaster. And the Somerset Fries in their history from the period too, history of Scotland, they say the Battle of Bannockburn was a decisive victory, the most crucial military success in all Scottish history. It did not end the war between Scotland and England, but it put Robert Bruce firmly in the ascendant. He had already demonstrated considerable skill as a general and leader. He had been fighting for a just cause. His reputation was beginning to make an impact in the courts and palaces of Europe. And now this victory enhanced it. At home, the people had a king to admire, to respect, and in the end to love. So an astounding victory from a smaller force against a very large army, and not only purely a military victory in that sense, but a major disaster for Edward II's army because of the losses, not only of the foot soldiers who were probably expendable, dare one say, any rate, but the knights that were killed. That was a major impact. And it paved the way then to eventually, Edward II would never acknowledge the right of the Scots to be an independent nation, or the right of Robert the Bruce to be king. But eventually, a situation arose where Edward did have to acknowledge that Bruce was King of Scotland. He didn't do that until 1323, when there was finally a truce in all of this period. And the following year, the Pope, who had been delivered the Declaration of Ardgrowth in 1320, which asserted the Scots' right to independence, he recognised Robert's title as well as King of Scotland. 4 years later, the Treaty of Northampton officially recognised Bruce's title. The family of Edward II were to be linked with the family of Bruce through his son David. Both of them were young children, were agreed to be betrothed together. So a sense of the coming together of the monarchical lines between England and Scotland was put in place in the sense of the longer term of all of this. Bruce died at the age of 57 in 1329. His son David was just 5 years old at that time, and a number of regents then had to govern Scotland. And there was an attempt then by John Balliol, son of John Balliol, Edward, to reassert the heir claim to the throne unsuccessfully. But effectively, Robert had really consolidated the position of his family in Scotland with the kingship. His brother Edward, who was significant at the siege of Stirling Castle and at the battle as well, was also then involved in this part of the world particularly, but Robert was also involved here. Robert was married. His second wife was connected to the Earl of Ulster, and Robert was feudal lord of parts of County Antrim as a consequence of that. One of his royal mandates at least was issued from Overfleet Castle in Larne, and he owned lands in the Glens of Antrim right up towards the north coast. So he was very familiar with the Antrim coast, and perhaps it's no surprise that whenever he was on the run after that earlier defeat we talked about, he had to hide out. There are a lot of places where he's said to have hidden out, and he probably did hide out in quite a lot of places. But the most famous story that is associated with Bruce is, as you probably know, the story of the spider. Story of the spider. There are quite a number of caves dotted around the coastline of Scotland where this spider is supposed to have lived. But Rathlin Island certainly has a very strong claim to Robert the Bruce hiding out there, because it was part of the feudal lands. It was very close to the Scottish coast, so it was easy access from Scotland if you were on the run, and easy access back again if you wanted to rally people around you. So that and of course, Rathlin has Bruce's castle on it and Bruce's cave as part of the place names in Rathlin. So it is quite likely that that's where he hid out for a time. Who can prove whether the spider was in Rathlin or not? It's certainly something we should hang on to, I think. And the whole point about the spider is to give Bruce a sense of tenacity and to continue on. The spider kept trying to weave its way despite the wind blowing and all of that. And Bruce is said to have learnt this sense of keeping on, being tenacious and so stubborn about trying to achieve what you want to achieve. We do know certainly that this part of the world played a significant part in the Bruce story, in the Scots story, and an attempt by Edward himself to govern Ireland. He was crowned King of Ireland. There are different accounts as to where that might have taken place. One of the accounts says it was in Carrickfergus, and that is possible. He was backed up by Robert at times, and he arrived in County Antrim, as John of the North had said, with an army at Larne in 26th of May 1315, with about at least 5,000 men, battle-hardened troops from Bannockburn in that period, and with the aim of conquering Ireland, and possibly also with the aim of establishing a pincer movement against the English. And there had been overtures from period just after around 1306 forward. There were overtures to Irish chieftains and also overtures to the Welsh. And some historians have speculated there was an attempt at a pan-Celtic alliance, a pincer movement around the English. And that is possible, entirely possible. We have a fantastic account of this period in a book written by a man called Archdeacon John Barber, called The Bruce. And it's a poetic, it's one of these long and rambling poetic offerings. And Barber was the Archdeacon of Aberdeen. He wrote the poem in 1375, detailing the years of Bruce's campaign for the throne, and he has provided to history one of the most outstanding sources for the period. He divided his work into 20 books, and there was a good reason for that, let me tell you, if you read it. But a considerable proportion of those books were based in this part of the world, showing the strong connection that Ireland was very significant, Ulster was very significant, and the Bruces were very much engaged with this part of the world. So what I thought we might do is have a wee look at this, just to give you, just in case you fall asleep. That happened. I hope I haven't been too pessimistic here, but I think I should have sheets for everybody, but we may end up having to share a sheet or two. Let's see how we go here.
Dr. Hume, this may seem like such a really stupid question, but what does the Bruce mean?
Well, I suppose it's just a term, as opposed to Robert. Well, it just means
Robert Bruce?
It would be Robert Bruce, yeah.
Okay.
But in the way it was.
The term the is associated with Scottish clans as the head of the clan.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, was he the head of a clan then, and his brother too, or were they just members of the clan?
He was head
No,
of the clan,
he would have been.
Okay.
and his brother would have been
Head of his clan?
head. No,
No. Because he's
well,
Edward,
in the
not
family,
Bruce.
he wouldn't be the Bruce.
Who?
Edward.
Edward.
It's all
But
getting
that was
complicated
called
now.
Edward the Bruce.
Well, I call him Edward the Bruce.
Yeah?
Well, actually, that little thread of debate underlines the discussion as to what was actually going on with Edward and Robert. Robert, as we saw, was quite hot-headed. Edward was quite impetuous as well.
So were they challenging each
Yeah,
other
well,
for head
some
of the
historians
clan?
would suggest that it was convenient for Robert to try and encourage Edward to win the kingship of Ireland, because he didn't feel one country was big enough for the two of them, effectively.
Okay, okay.
And there may be an element of that. There was probably also an element of, well, I think there was an attempt to build a dynasty in the Irish context, probably. And there also was, I think, an element of attempting to have some sort of alliance, because England was the major component, and still is, of the British Isles, of course, population-wise and all the rest of it. So there were considerable overtures made to Irish chieftains. There were overtures made to the Welsh in terms of an alliance against the English. So that I think all of those things came together, but on a personal level, the situation between Edward and Robert was that they really were competitive, and Robert may have been concerned in the longer term as to what might happen in relation to all of that.
Okay.
So he would probably have called himself Edward the Bruce, even if we shouldn't. Anyway, I'm going to cheat a little because I've got an English translation here.
That's in English.
That's good. So, if you want to go, this is just, I say this is a section of this. There's 20 books of this, but this section I thought was relevant because we're talking about, well, what are we talking about? Does anybody deduce what this is actually all about?
The Bruce.
Beyond that?
Going to Ireland to become king.
Okay.
It says it in the first few lines.
Yep. And can you identify what areas, where are we talking about in this section?
Haven't got that far.
Right.
Ardrossan.
What areas? Yeah, yes indeed, but what areas on this side of the channel? Ardrossan is mentioned. Fergus of Ardrossan is one of the chiefs.
Island of Ireland. Rathlin, no. Ishery of Ireland, no.
Oh, there's Craig Fergus there. Craig Fergus mentioned.
Yes.
Where's that?
And Shire Fergus, Fallen,
Yeah.
Ayr.
Oh, you,
Yes, he mentions the end of that section in the second column talks about Craig Fergus.
Oh, yeah.
George Craig Fergus at 2C, so he came as a tourist effectively, if you believe that line. But there's somewhere else as well, further up that's mentioned, which is also in this area. May not have identified it because it's the medieval English name. It's not what it's called today. But he says in Walring's Firth, arriveth they softly but Bergen or a city. So it's where Walring's Firth is.
Lauren Law.
Larnlaw. It's also known as Wolkingsforth. Ulfricsfjord in Nordic times, then anglicised, became Olderfleet. The old name Olderfleet still survives, and we now call it Larnlaw. So what he's saying there is that they arrived in Larnlaw safely, without any opposition. And he sailed from the port of Ayr on the 26th of May. He arrived at Larnlaw in the area that would be called the Curran of Larn today. So you can imagine 5,000 men and the ships that would be used to convey. There was quite a fleet of ships arriving at that time.
50?
Hmm?
How many ships did you say?
Anyway, 5,000 men.
So like, yeah.
I'm not sure how many ships. I don't know whether I've seen the figure for the number of ships or whether there is a figure for the number. But he had 5,000. 5,000 to 6,000 men is what it's usually
Right.
given as.
30 men to a ship.
30 men to a ship.
That's hard to.
They maybe shuttled back and forward. Shuttled backwards and forwards,
Well,
yeah.
I don't know. It doesn't, there is some.
Maybe 200 ships.
There's some thought that they may not all have arrived in Larne. That they may have arrived in an area from Glendon right down through the Glens into Larne. But there's not much evidence of that effectively, and certainly in this one here it talks about arriving in Olderfleet. But some historians have speculated that Red Bay and those areas, that was areas in the Glens of Eltham which were quite isolated, far from the authorities, if you like. If you wanted to bring in an invading force, it was a good opportunity to have beachheads and so forth.
200 ships you would need.
Yeah.
If you bring in horses, knights with horses. They bring in knights.
Yes, he is, and some of them are listed.
They only put about 6 horses to a ship.
6 horses to a ship.
Well, ships are only fishing boats, really.
Yeah, that's interesting. So about 200. That would have been scary sort of fleet.
Well, I'm taking the numbers from where they're used,
Yeah.
things, the number of ships they use.
Well, a major expedition then, by any accounts. Let's see if I'll read you to what this actually says. Let's see where we are here. Yeah. Okay, it's quite a sizable portion. Sir Edward, Earl of Carrick, who was stronger than a leopard and had no desire to live in peace, felt that Scotland was too small for both him and his brother, hence the speculation, and a barbarous sin in 1375. Therefore he formed the purpose that he would become King of Ireland. To that end he sent and negotiated with the Arashi of Ireland, who in good faith undertook to make him King of all Ireland, provided that he could overcome by hard fighting the Englishmen who dwelt in the land then, while they would help with all their might. He, hearing them make this promise, was very pleased in his heart, and with the king's consent assembled to himself men of great courage. Then he took ship at Ayr in the following month of May, and took his way straight to Ireland. He had in his company there Earl Thomas, who was a worthy man, good Sir Philip Mowbray, who was staunch under great pressure, Sir John Solis, a good knight, and Sir John Stewart, a brave one, also Ramsay of Auchterhouse, who was brave and chivalrous, Sir Fergus of Ardrossan, and many another knight. They arrived safely in Larnloch without opposition or attack, and sent home all their ships. They have undertaken a great project when, with so few as there were, 6,000 men no more, they prepared to conquer all Ireland, where they would see many thousands come armed to fight against them. But although few, they were brave, and without fear or dread took the way in 2 divisions toward Carrickfergus to see it, as many tourists have done since, of course. But the lords of that country, Mandeville, Bissett and Logan, assembled every one of their men. The savages were there too, and when they were all gathered, they numbered about 20,000, almost 20,000. And then it goes on, and it talks about battle taking place. And as far as we're aware, what happened was Bruce landed at Larne. There is an account of a battle at a place called Paithfoot outside Glenarm during this period too, which might add some substance to the idea that they landed in different parts along the coast. But certainly the first battle that is recorded as having been fought was at Mount Hill outside Larne. Some of you maybe know the landscape and know where that is. There's still the Mount Hill Fair is still held there every year. And that was where the Normans, the Norman lords, assembled their force to try and repel Bruce, because they obviously knew that they had to defeat him and get him pushed back to the sea. Otherwise, if they got a foothold, then it was going to be a very difficult situation. The end result of that battle, we don't know too much about the details of the battle, but we know the end result. That Barber says in his account of that these families assembled against Bruce. And there's a bit of a melee in this battle. There was considerable battle, and then he says, in the fighting, all hail the Fleur of Ulster fell. The flower of the knights of Ulster were defeated in this battle, were killed in this battle, and Bruce was victorious and moved inland then. And he moved, as far as we're aware, he moved up towards what is now Ballinure, in that general area where there was a Logan Castle, which obviously was on his radar. And then he moved down towards Carrickfergus, where he laid siege to the castle. They appear to have, it quaintly says, I think, in one of Barber's lines, that they took lodgings in Carrickfergus. It sounds as if they really were tourists, but it was a bit more forceful than that. But the castle still held out against them for quite a time. And Carrickfergus was very significant because it helped to command the sea route, of course. And that's why the Scots were interested in it, that's why the English wanted to hold on to it. And there was a Scottish privateer, shall we call him, called Thomas Dunn, who was up and down the Irish Sea, was attacking English shipping, making it very difficult for people to move around by sea. So Carrickfergus was significant as a naval base. Is a bit too grand for a title, but that's effectively what it was, a base for ships to operate from. So they do capture Carrickfergus. There is a story that Bruce is crowned king here. He's crowned king of Ireland. He certainly is crowned king of Ireland at some point. I think Dundalk has a claim that he was crowned king there. But it's very possible that it was Carrickfergus. It was a very ancient settlement, very relevant settlement as far as Scots were concerned. Any of them that knew their history from ancient history and so on would have known the significance of this being part of the old kingdoms of Dalry and Dalriada. And it was also the main garrison, effectively, in the north. So it was a significant place. If you want to be crowned king, probably the most significant place that you could pick. But he also headed down to Patrick, which would have been the old Norman capital, the Earl of Ulster. And then they pushed further south. all of this takes place in the context of Bruce trying to get the Irish chieftains on his side, and he does manage that, and some historians really would say that the Irish chieftains were as bad as the medieval Scots in terms of changing sides with winds that blew, and it was a very difficult thing to gauge whose support you were going to have for any length of time. But he did try that, and he had O'Neill allies, he had McQuillans, he had McCartans, who sided with him, particularly in the areas in County Antrim. In the excursions south, he did some backup from Robert, who came across a number of times, and fresh soldiers were sent over a number of times. But this was a very savage conflict. It was punctuated by a sense of torch and destroy the landscape, make it inhospitable for any other army to survive on, and as a consequence of all of that, but there was also bad weather too, but as a consequence of all of this there was famine, and famine bred disease, and so a lot of people died of disease as opposed to warfare in this period. He moved further south and west in Ireland, but gradually they came back up towards Dundalk, and Edward was, in 1318, was to lose his life in the Battle of Fort Hill outside Dundalk, where he was killed. It's said that he's buried there, and people in Dundalk are certainly very adamant that that's the case. It was said, local legend around Mount Hill was that his body was brought back and buried there, which was his first victory in Irish soil. And there were some interesting aspects in the landscape, certainly until the 19th century at any rate. There was what was called Bruce's Stones at Mount Hill, which was supposedly a cairn erected over the site of the battlefield, and legend had it that it's where Bruce was buried, and his body was brought back and buried there. It's possible it was one of two things. It may have been a cairn over the bodies of some of the knights who were killed in the battle, or it may have been an earlier prehistoric monument, and there are a number in that area. There's a series of stone circles not so far away from that site, which were Neolithic, for example, so it wouldn't be beyond the bounds that things could be Neolithic period, and would be ascribed then to something that people had attributed to a later period. One interesting aspect is that we do have at least one place name that relates to this whole period, not in Carrickfergus, but in the area where he took his army towards the Logan Castle. If you travel up the A8 road, you'll pass by Bruslee. I'm sure some of you know Bruslee, which means the field of Bruce, or the camp of Bruce. That's where it gets its name from, and that's where, obviously, in that area was where the army was camped out, somewhere in between the Logan Castle and heading down towards Carrickfergus. So to me, it's quite fascinating that name has survived. It's a name that's really lost in the context of what it means to most people. I know that there is a project underway for next year to commemorate this Bruce expedition, and one of the sites that was talked about was Bruslee, but there was nowhere to put anything up safely at Bruslee, and there's nothing really very touristy that will encourage people to stay at Bruslee, so it's very unfortunate, but it is significant that it gives us a pointer to part of the landscape of Bruce at that time. One thing he did do was he would have scattered the Norman settlement here, and if you look at the area around Carrickfergus, there's many Norman mottes dotted around the landscape still, and the impact of Bruce's invasion was to wipe out that settlement. They would either have been killed in the battles or they would have fled. We know that afterwards, after this whole period, in 1320, one of the landowners in a place called Kilkennan, Sir Michael of Kilkennan, is listed as having sided with Bruce in this struggle, and as having his lands seized, because the Prior of St John of Jerusalem in Ireland, which was a chivalric order, in 1320 they complained to the king of the losses which they sustained to the Scots and the rebels, as they put it, especially through the instrumentality of Michael of Kilkennan and John Fitznicholas of Slane, which was in the Ards. Well, Kilkennan is now known by the name of Kilcoen and Island Magee, so Michael of Kilcoen was obviously a Norman who sided with Bruce. The interesting thing is that the Knights of St John of Jerusalem were the rivals to the Knights Templar. So again, it gives interesting thoughts as to the connections that were going on here in the background that aren't really listed in all of this. But we know that lands were seized as a consequence that Michael of Kilkennan lost his lands because he was on the wrong side and because he had seized lands as well. But we also can presume that a lot of the Norman families were disappeared by this whole episode, which again made for an interesting situation, and I suppose because the Normans had effectively were governing East Ulster, which was called the Earldom of Ulster, and was the area that the Normans could safely govern. They didn't govern further west because you couldn't take your armoured horses and your knights and so on into the marshes and so on of the west. But the Earldom of Ulster, Antrim and Down, was much more suitable territory to govern and to have all your fighting knights and horses to back you up. The death of Bruce effectively was the end of this grand ambition that the Scots had to govern both Scotland and Ireland, and whatever else they planned as a consequence of that, a pincer movement, putting pressure on the English. But it didn't succeed. Robert the Bruce certainly had some interest in the area, but the cost of this was quite high. Enormous losses to Scots. A lot of, I think Fergus of Ardrossan's mentioned in our piece here, but he was killed further south in one of the battles, for example, in Meath there. So a lot of these knights didn't go back to Scotland. And to some extent, I suppose, because it was such a bad period in the context of loss and warfare and famine and so forth, there are scattered references to it. Barber's is the best account. It gives us exactly what happened. There's some folklore, not too much folklore, but some folklore, and place names that relate to it. But largely almost sort of forgotten period of history. And a period of Scots history, Ulster Scots history, that isn't really that well known about. Had they succeeded, history would have been very interesting, but they didn't, and they left these scattered remains and folklore that, for example, the Agnew families in Ballygowan outside Larne were supposedly descendants of Bruce's soldiers that had come over and that ended up staying here and so forth. Not quite sure whether that's the case or not. The Agnews would have been they were Anglo-Norman family, or Scotia-Norman family that came to Loch Ryan, where there's still a new castle there, and they came across to Kilwater, of course, outside Larne as well. So the folklore has sort of kept things, I suppose, alive to some extent, but it's often a forgotten period, but a very interesting period in the context of it all, and it leaves some questions open to discussion as to what was really going on with the Bruces. Did Robert just sort of agree to ever going across because he wanted them out of his hair? He wanted them to form a separate dynasty, didn't want them in Scotland because he felt the two of them would conflict and there'd be intrigues and all the rest of it. And what would have happened had he succeeded, had he managed to? And he wasn't far off at times, really, in terms of the context of all of this, in succeeding. How would that have panned out? Was there a thought-out plan for a sort of pan-Celtic community of the realm, if you like, as they would have referred to Scotland at that point? Or was there not? Was it just an attempt to buy in and support? And indeed, would the Irish chieftains have all agreed? They didn't all agree in terms of Bruce, and some of them opposed him and some of them didn't. But would they have fallen out as time went on? That was one of the fears the Scots had, that There was a lot of intrigue within the Irish chieftains, and it was difficult for them to understand all of that because they were sort of transplanted into the midst of it all. But a fascinating period, and the anniversary of Bannockburn, of course, is going to be remembered very much this year because it's a major anniversary, 700th anniversary. And next year will be the equally as important anniversary in terms of this part of the world of Bruce's arrival here, and the sort of continuum of Scottish history in this part of the world too. So that's a sort of flavour of things. I expect you to go home and practice your medieval Scots.
Where is Brusley?
Brusley is, the Newry Council have a recycling area there now. So if you go up the A8, at the present time, I don't know what it'll be like after the road's finished, but at the present time when you go up to the A8, you come to the council recycling is in a flat area. There's a couple of traffic islands. So you're meaning a big long stretch on the land route from Ballymuir.
It's near Hillhead Sheds,
Or the
Garden
Logwood
Hogwood Garden
Garden Centre. So that's really where it is. But there's nothing really to tell you very much about it, unfortunately.
Why did he go to Larne Loch? Was it just to see if he could gather stuff on his way and sneak up on the castle? Or did he know that the castle was being guarded or something? And
Well, the castle would have been a formidable. You wouldn't have attempted to bring your army in here because of the castle, because you had the garrison, and they came out. You also had then the ability to have ships, of course, too, at the castle because the garrison was there.
right.
So I suspect Larnock was the nearest he could safely get, which was large enough to land. Well, however many ships came in, we're not sure if they all came in or not, but.
Yeah.
And it was within the sort of ambit of Robert's feudal territories, because Robert did issue a mandate from Olderfleet Castle, which may or may not be the ruin that we see today known as Olderfleet Castle, but he issued a mandate from there, so they regarded it as part of their territory. And they also, the Bissets at that point held Olderfleet Castle, and the accounts differ. Some accounts say that the Bissets welcomed Edward, and other accounts say that they opposed him, and they talk about the Bissets being among the people who opposed him. But equally, there's talk that one of the Bissets may have opposed him, but another may have welcomed him in. So they were hedging their bets.
You see this?
That would be why they came into law.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You see this? People didn't know what side they were on. Everybody was on everybody else's side. Well, not a criticism, but if everybody was on everybody else's side, they would therefore know of each other's strengths and weaknesses. So I can't see how they kept on making, the English kept on making the mistake of not knowing the strength of armies and that sort of stuff. If some of the Scots had been on their side at one point, shortly before or shortly thereafter.
Well, yes, in general terms, yes. Although at the time of Bannockburn, there wasn't in the same. Remember when we talked about Falkirk, that there were people who changed sides,
Yes.
or supposedly changed
Yes.
sides within the
Yes.
side. There's not any accounts, I don't think, of that at Bannockburn, and you're dealing with a much smaller force. So I think it's a much more constrained force. It's much more focused, and there's maybe less chance of that happening with it.
Right.
But I mean, it definitely was a period where you get just the impression they're very Machiavellian in all the dealings, because it's hard to tell.
They're all like Putin.
They're all looking out for themselves. It's quite a brutal period. If you pick the wrong side, it's not going to be too good for you. So there's a lot of, it's a very Machiavellian period of plotting and intrigue and so forth. But I think that at the time of Bannockburn, you had gone through this period where, when we arrive at Bannockburn, we're dealing with these 7,000 really quite battle-hardened troops who are very supportive of Robert the Bruce, and certainly no accounts of people changing sides at that point. And it may be because he mainly has a lot of infantry and foot soldiers and so many knights who were the people most prone to changing sides.
Going back to the cause of Bannockburn, the wording of the siege of Stirling is quite important. The treaty, as I understood it, was that the Mowbray said that he would surrender unless a relieving force came to relieve him
Yeah.
after the Battle of Bannockburn. this is one of the stupid chivalry things of the period. The Bruce lifted the siege of Stirling because he said a relieving force had arrived.
Right, yes. Yeah.
Then the Mowbray treated with the Bruce, came into the favour of the Scottish king. If you read your bottom line of the poem, the Mowbray came here
Yeah.
with his brother, because he could no longer be.
Yeah, yeah.
Apparently he surrendered in the castle on terms that the garrison were to be spared and either allowed to return to England or to live. I just want to go to England, the free passage and so on. They were shipped out,
Yeah,
so they wouldn't have to traverse through the
yeah,
every Scotsman will be
yeah.
like this.
Yeah.
They were shipped out and some stayed as garrison.
Well, I mean, that would make a lot of sense, because people were changing sides,
Yes.
and that's an example of
But
it.
your poem puts the Mowbray here then, you see.
Yeah, it is mentioned, isn't it? Yeah.
And he was,
I think that he also, whenever Edward's army arrived, he tried to suggest that there didn't need to be a battle, because the army was there, and effectively, the agreement was that unless, as you said, unless the castle was relieving force. So he tried to argue with, I think, well, maybe not personally with the king, but he tried to argue that there was no need to take on the Scots, that the agreement was such as it was, and that everybody was going to agree with the agreement, which of course was not going to happen, I don't think. But yes, he's an interesting character, and well, yes, very, very. Well, I still think he was very brave to refuse the king admission to the castle. I have to say.
That's method in the madness, I think, that is almost.
I just knew which side of Stoke got it on.
Well, I think our reenactors are going to perhaps explain to us about the.
Is that a 15th century copy?
That, yes, well, that is from John Barber's poem, was translated by a man called A.A.M. Duncan. And this is a paper print. I'm trying to find out when it was first produced by him. I think it's the 1990s. But there's quite a lot of detail that he has gone through it and produced the English version of what the medieval actually means.
So that's very 15th century.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm not an expert in
just for
medieval. I don't know. But I know he produced that translation of it all, which is very detailed. Our reenactors want to do their bit now, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Well, last week we were talking about Falkirk, and this week now is Bannockburn. And whenever it's mentioned, you think of Braveheart, the movie. And stereotypically, this is what you're going to think of a Scottish soldier on the field of battle would have been wearing. Now, we're not going to get into the debate of where he would have been wearing a kilt, or whether targs would have been used at the time, even though they were very popular within the 15th and 16th century. But what we will discuss is what was popular where at the time. Now, Scots would have wore trousers. I mean, as far back as the Picts would have been wearing trousers in Scotland. The Romans actually put down that they thought that the Picts were barbaric because they wore trousers on their legs. They didn't just wear bare-legged like the Romans were. But anybody who's been to Scotland, especially in the winter time, would know that the weather's very unpredictable and it does get slightly chilly. Now, the Romans caught on very quick. And they actually started to wear trousers underneath their tunics to keep themselves warm throughout the winter. So without a doubt, the Scots would have had to have worn some sort of trousers throughout the winter months. But the kilts did come into fashion, as well as long tunics and the Gaelic linné, which would have been a longer version of this, a baggier version. The linné would have went right down to the floor, but the way it was worn would have been folded up and pulled up over the belt and worn at knee length. This would have been your sort of everyday kind of wear. Gallowglass knights actually would have went into battle wearing their linné. They would have just thrown their suit of mail over the top, their helmet, and away they went. So it wasn't just for daily wear, it would have been used for military purposes as well. Now, well, especially in Bannockburn, Whereas in Falkirk, Wallace's army would have been made up mostly of common men who would have tried to have basically scrounged what they would have been wearing, their weapons, their shields, any armour they could have picked up along the way. I mean, they defeated the English at Stirling Bridge, so I'm sure there's a hell of a lot of Scottish soldiers out there stripping the English of what they could have worn, what fitted them. But at Bannockburn it was slightly different. There was more noblemen supporting the cause. There's more noblemen back in Bruce to fight Edward II. And we've got a knight here. And this is what, I mean, knights on both sides, from Edward II and the Bruce's army, would have been wearing the likes of this. This would have been your common knight. Full set of shirt with mail. Again, slight more plate armour. Would have been partially plated. Shoulders, bracers, maybe even greaves. As well as the good old bucket helmets, the great helm. Anybody sort of, any crusade films, that's what they would have been wearing. This is not too far around the same period of time. And it was this helmet that the knight would have been wearing that ambushed Bruce, but he would have been on horseback with a lance. And it was this kind of axe that Bruce would have actually have used to split the helmet in two. Now, having worn something like this and knowing what sort of damage that can withhold, and knowing how much damage an axe can do, it must have been one ferocious swing to actually split a helmet like that open. And the knight underneath would have been wearing mail coif on the head as well. So to split a helmet open with just an axe would have been absolutely unbelievable to do at the time. And after it was done, the Bruce was being pulled away to safety, and all the man was worried about was breaking his axe. That's all he was worried about, because the axe shattered. The wooden part of the axe actually shattered, and that's all he was worried about, was losing his trusted axe. And it must have been some axe to do that amount of damage. Now, other weapons at the time, on both sides, would have been a one-handed sword. Now, this one typically would have been medieval. This would have been new at the time. The likes of this one is earlier. This is your Norman one-handed sword. And there were actually swords that actually dated back to the late Viking times that would have been used on the battlefield. So that just goes to show you how expensive swords were to make at the time. They were passed down and passed down. And if you got your hands on one, you would have kept it